Bill Maher is a lot of things. Annoying, unfunny, misogynistic, Islamophobic, and of course, pro-Israel. The noted atheist is very, very pro the Jewish state, so much so that he can't stop lying in order to defend it.
In today's video, Mehdi Hasan unleashes fury on Bill Maher on Zaytio. Mehdi Hasan's pushback against Bill Maher really challenges one of the most common narratives that conflicts involving Israel are always purely defensive. Because when you look at history, it's not that simple. Events like the Suez Crisis and the Six-Day War show that decisions were often influenced by strategy and timing, not just immediate self-defense. Even leaders involved later admitted the situation wasn't as clear-cut as it was presented. That's the bigger point here. Once you dig into the facts, the good versus bad framing starts to fall apart. So let's dive in and watch how Mehdi Hasan shuts down Bill Maher on Zaytio.
Here he is on Friday's episode of Real Time on HBO.
To me, what the Democrats are not doing with this is leading. The energy in their parties with the young people who learn everything about Israel on TikTok. They don't know shit. And their leaders are not standing up and saying, kids, you don't know what's going on here. Every war Israel has fought is a war of defense.
Right.
Every war, they were attacked first.
The kids don't know shit, Bill? Or is that you? Time for a debunking. Let's look at Israel's wars, because Israel's fought a lot of wars. But let's just take a look at three of the major ones. Who started them? First off, 1956, the Suez Crisis, also known as the Second Arab-Israeli War. Israel, Britain and France colluded together to invade Egypt and to try and topple President Nasser. Israel attacked on October the 29th and Britain and France joined 2 days later. Now, the Israelis always say that any war they start is a defensive war, a preemptive war. But we actually know that Israel, France and Britain got together to plan this war of aggression a week earlier in Sèvres, France. Even super partisan Israeli politician and historian Michael Oren admits that then Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion's plan in 1956 at Sèvres was for dividing Jordan between Israel and Iraq and Lebanon between Israel and Syria. It was a war of conquest, not defense. Israeli Colonel Mordechai Baron, who took note at the Sèvres meeting, was embarrassed by what he heard. He later said the Israeli-British-French plan was, quote, more fitted to the kind of imperial discussions which took place at the end of the Great War and was totally out of place, he said, for the post-World War II era. Hey, Bill, it was an imperial war that Israel started in 1956.
Mehdi Hasan going at Bill Maher is blunt, but honestly he's forcing a conversation people usually avoid, this idea that every conflict involving Israel can be neatly labeled as pure self-defense. Because once you actually look at history, that claim doesn't really hold up. Take the Suez Crisis. This wasn't some spontaneous reaction. Britain, France, and Israel coordinated that operation ahead of time after Egypt nationalized the canal. Even declassified documents and historians, including Israeli ones, have acknowledged it was a strategic move tied to influence and control, not just immediate survival. And it doesn't stop there. The Six-Day War is often framed as a necessary preemptive strike, but later statements from Israeli leaders like Menachem Begin suggested Egypt wasn't about to launch an imminent attack. That doesn't erase the tension at the time, but it does complicate the "we had no choice" narrative. Then you look at the 1982 Lebanon War, which was initially justified around security concerns, but expanded far beyond that, ultimately aiming to reshape Lebanon's political landscape and weaken the PLO. Even an official Israeli inquiry, the Kayhan Commission, found serious issues with how that war was conducted. That's really where Mehdi's point lands. It's not about saying one side is always right or wrong, it's about rejecting this overly clean version of history where everything fits into a defensive box. Governments, including democratic ones, make decisions based on a mix of security, strategy, and politics. That's just reality. So when someone says every war was defensive, it's not just oversimplified, it ignores a huge amount of documented history. And that's why Mehdi's pushback hits. He's not inventing anything new, he's just pointing out what's already been said, just not often enough.
Number two, let's go to 1967, the Six-Day War, the conflict that opened the door to Israel's illegal occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, the longest ongoing military occupation in the world. Israel attacked Egypt in June 1967 before expanding their attacks to Syria and Jordan. Now, the standard Israeli narrative is that this was a preemptive war, that President Nasser of Egypt had mobilized his forces in the Sinai, kicked out UN peacekeepers, and was about to attack Israel, and that the Jewish state's very existence, as its then Prime Minister Levi Eshkol claimed, hung on a thread. But that was all bullshit. Egypt wasn't about to attack Israel. Don't take my word for it. In 1982, the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin admitted, and I quote, "In June 1967, we again had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him." Do you hear that, Bill? In 1968, a year after the Six-Day War, Israel's own military chief, General Yitzhak Rabin, who went on to serve as a Nobel Peace Prize-winning Prime Minister of Israel, he told a French journalist, and I quote, "I do not believe that Nasser wanted war. The 2 divisions he sent into Sinai on May 14th would not have been enough to unleash an offensive against Israel. He knew it, and we knew it." But Bill Maher doesn't seem to know it. Multiple other Israeli officials have said the same, by the way. In the years since, one of the top Israeli generals who pushed for war in June 1967, Matityahu Peled, later said that all the talk of a threat to Israel from Egypt was nothing but a bluff. Israeli wartime cabinet minister Mordechai Bentov later confessed that this whole story about the threat of extermination was totally contrived to justify the annexation of new Arab territories. So no, the Six-Day War in 1967 wasn't a preemptive war. It wasn't a war of self-defense. It was a war of aggression and occupation by Israel against its Arab neighbors.
Mehdi Hasan going after Bill Maher here is intense, but the core of what he's pushing is something a lot of mainstream conversations just skip over. History isn't as clean as people want it to be. Take the Six-Day War. It's almost always framed as a last-minute act of survival, but even Israeli archives that were declassified decades later show internal debates where leaders knew the situation was more strategic than existential. Israel had a clear military advantage at the time, especially in air power, which played a huge role in the outcome. That context matters because it shows the decision wasn't made in a vacuum of panic, it was calculated. And the aftermath is just as important as the lead-up. That war led to Israel taking control of the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, territories that are still at the center of global disputes today. The United Nations passed UN Resolution 242 right after, calling for withdrawal from occupied territories, which tells you even the international community didn't see the outcome as something that could just be accepted as normal. What Mehdi is really reacting to is that blanket statement. Every war was defensive. Because once you look at primary sources, statements from officials, and what actually happened afterward, it becomes clear that multiple motivations were in play. Security, yes, but also territorial control and long-term positioning. And this isn't unique to Israel, by the way. Governments all over the world have historically framed military action as defensive. It's politically easier to justify. You saw similar narratives from the US during the Iraq War, where the initial justification didn't fully line up with what was later revealed. That's why Mehdi's frustration comes through. It's not just about disagreeing, it's about pushing back on a version of history that leaves out key facts. Because once you start digging into the details, the idea that it was all purely defensive just doesn't hold up the way it's often presented.
Again. And finally, number 3. Let's go to Lebanon. 1982, Israel launched an illegal invasion of southern Lebanon, killing thousands of civilians and kickstarting its 18-year brutal occupation of that country. Now, you might say, well, they were fighting Hezbollah. But Hezbollah didn't exist until Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982. Oh, wait, but there was the PLO before that. There were Palestinian terrorists in Lebanon. In fact, the Israeli military says on its own website that what they called Operation Peace for the Galilee was launched on June the 6th, 1982, following a terrorist cell's failed attempt to assassinate the Israeli ambassador to the UK. Well, here's the slight problem. That terrorist cell wasn't from the PLO. It wasn't an assassination attempt ordered by Yasser Arafat or anyone in Lebanon. It was from the Abu Nidal organization based in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. The Abu Nidal organization that was a sworn foe of the PLO and whose leader had even been sentenced to death in absentia by the PLO. But as Israel's top general in 1982 sneered at a cabinet meeting on the eve of invading Lebanon, Abu Nidal, Abu Shmidal, we have to strike at the PLO. To be clear then, Israel used that assassination attempt on their ambassador in London to illegally invade and occupy Lebanon, which had nothing to do with it, and they did so not for self-defense or security reasons, but because they wanted to take out the PLO, and because, as historian Zachary Foster pointed out in a recent piece for Zeteo, the Zionist movement has wanted to expand Israel's borders into Lebanon for over 100 years. So that is what Israel does. That is what the historical record shows. Israel attacking its neighbors, attacking Arab countries without justification and in violation of international law. And they're doing it again, right now, to Iran. When Bill Maher says the kids don't know shit about the history of Israel's wars, it's pure projection on his part. Every war they were attacked first? Shut up.
Mehdi Hasan unleashing on Bill Maher here is aggressive, yes, but the frustration makes sense when you actually look at the record instead of the talking points. Take the 1982 Lebanon War. It's usually framed as a necessary response to terrorism, but even Israeli officials later admitted the operation went far beyond that original justification. The stated goal was to push the PLO back from the border, but the campaign expanded all the way to Beirut, which wasn't exactly a limited defensive move. That escalation alone tells you this wasn't just about immediate security. And then there's what happened during the occupation that followed. Israel stayed in southern Lebanon for nearly 2 decades until 2000. During that time, resistance movements grew, including Hezbollah, which, like Mehdi points out, didn't exist before the invasion. That's a pattern we've seen in a lot of conflicts. Military interventions can end up creating the very threats they were meant to eliminate. There's also the humanitarian side that often gets glossed over. The Sabra and Shatila massacre became one of the most infamous moments of that war. An Israeli commission, the Kayhan Commission, found that Israeli leadership bore indirect responsibility for allowing allied militias into the camps where the killings happened. That's not something critics made up. That's from Israel's own investigation. So when Mehdi pushes back on the idea that every war was purely defensive, he's not just ranting, he's pointing to documented events, admissions, and outcomes that complicate that narrative. And honestly, that's the bigger issue here. When people reduce decades of conflict into one clean explanation, it shuts down any real understanding of how and why these wars actually happened. You don't have to agree with every word Mehdi says, or the way he says it, but the underlying point is hard to ignore. Once you start looking at the full historical context, the always defensive argument just doesn't hold up the way it's often presented.